Ancient cultures around the world had a ruling class that practiced intentional cranial modification, a procedure to deliberately reshape the skull to express status, wealth, and nobility. Some of the oldest examples of this were dated as far back as 5,000 to 12,000 years ago in China and spans continents around the world. Was this an attempt to imitate an advanced race of beings with elongated heads? If so, might they be extraterrestrials? And what evidence suggests that they actually existed?
In my opinion, there was an advanced civilization on this planet at one point who were our progenitors. I very much believe they had elongated skulls from what we can see in all our ancient iconography and mythologies, and subsequently, all the other civilizations that followed attempted to mimic them. Sometimes that included cranial deformation, at other times that included different hats and symbolism, but we know that they existed and we know that they came before us.
Why should humans make elongated head, and how? We know it from Central and South America. When the Spanish conqueror arrived, for example, in today's Peru, they saw some of the young priest boys which had long heads, and they asked them, how did these long heads come from? They brought them at home, and at home they saw, the Spanish conqueror, they saw the babies. The babies were just burned. They just left the mother's womb, and because the head, the bones are soft, they pressed the bones of the boys so that the bones became longer and longer.
The reason that this mimicry or cranial deformation took place is because these rulers with elongated skulls were venerated in the ancient world. Who were they trying to mimic? Who were they trying to uphold? Again, we have this very ancient connection to these rulers with elongated skulls.
While elongated skulls are a worldwide phenomena, some of the best examples to have been scientifically examined come from Peru. 4 hours south of Lima is the Paracas Peninsula of Peru, an area surrounded by rich agricultural landscapes and a civilization that can be traced back to at least 5,000 years. It is here, in 1928, that archaeologist Julio Tello discovered a collection of enormously elongated skulls. Canadian scientist Brian Forrester has lived in Peru for the past 10 years, dedicating his entire focus to studying these specimens.
And it wasn't until about 12 years ago when I entered this museum here, owned by Senior Juan Navarro, who was a local amateur archaeologist, that I saw my first elongated skull. And actually it's a mummified one. And coming from a biological pre-med background, I was astonished at seeing this because I couldn't understand what it was. We have examples of skulls, the oldest ones, which appear to be natural elongated skulls. And then later on, when you have the Nazca culture interacting with the Paracas, that's when the head binding began. Standard academia states that the Paracas arrived on the coast of Peru, or evolved as a group, as a cohesive group, probably around 800 BC or 600 BC, but that's not based on any radiocarbon analysis at all. It's a supposition. So we're the only ones who have been able to actually do radiocarbon testing, and the results that we have been able to get do fit into that timeline. The oldest one that we've been able to radiocarbon test is around 2,400 years old. So that's near the beginning of the so-called Paracas period. Again, among the original elongated skulls, which we believe were born with elongated skulls, they have eye sockets which are probably 50% larger than normal and are more vertically elongated. Also, the jaw, the lower jaw, the mandible, is much larger than normal. And then there are also these two holes in the back of the skull here, which are a genetic characteristic. And what they probably indicate is that was for blood and nerve flow in order to properly feed and nourish the vertically elongated head.
Radiocarbon testing has dated the oldest elongated skull to approximately 2,400 years old. That's the beginning of the so-called Paracas period.
The intriguing thing about the fact that the earliest elongated skulls, almost 100, if not 100% of them, they show that they had, while they were alive, a very rich, dark, reddish hair. And that is not a Native American characteristic. That's another suggestion of migration from somewhere else. Most people think of red hair as being the characteristic of Scandinavians or Irish people or Scottish people, but in fact, it goes back to the Middle East. And that's somewhat in the area where we're starting to see a genetic DNA relationship as well. Two major hair experts studying hundreds of samples of Paracas red hair have stated that black hair always remains black. Red hair, of course, over the course of time can lighten to blondish. You know, that is a genetic characteristic that doesn't fit in with standard history of Native American people of the coast of Peru. And the other thing is none of the skulls that we've examined show canine teeth. So they don't have the canine, you know, predatory meat-eating tooth that we have. They're all quite normal or regular looking, and that's an anomaly. Well, the basic characteristics that distinguish cranial deformation from a natural skull is the lack of the suture line. I'm not talking about a partial lack, it's non-existent.
In a normal human skull, the sagittal suture, which is a connective tissue joint between the two parietal bones of the skull, appears from the frontal plate and continues over the dome of the skull, connecting with the occipital plate in the rear. Many of the skulls discovered in Paracas, however, are completely devoid of a sagittal suture. Might this be a genetic anomaly of a human being, or point to other possibilities worth considering? While intentional cranial modification changes the shape of the skull, the question remains, would it alter other features that are characteristic of a regular human skull?
It's mainly in the skull characteristics that we find these massive anomalies, including what's called the foramen magnum, and that is where your spinal column enters the bottom of your skull. In the original elongated skulls of this area, the foramen magnum is a full 1 inch back from where it's supposed to be, because with us, of course, it's at the balance point, so it's almost in the center. But the original Paracas, it's basically 1 inch backwards, and that matches with the vertical elongated skull characteristic. We've had many doctors, many nurses, many dentists, and even like brain specialists and brain surgeons and people like that physically come and look at the skulls. And again, what most of them say is, that's not something that I studied in medical school, especially the lack of the sagittal suture, the fact that the eye sockets are at least 50% larger than normal, the two holes in the back of the skull, and the fact that the foramen magnum is a full 1 inch back. That can't be explained through head binding or anything like that. That has to be genetic. That's proof positive, according to medical experts that I've shown that discovery to, that these were not Homo sapiens sapiens. At minimum, they were a subspecies of Homo sapien. The standard story, again from academics, is that all of the people of this area were descended from people whose ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge. And if that was the case, then the maternal haplogroup, which is the mother's DNA, would be haplogroup B, because only 4 bloodlines or haplogroups cross the Bering Land Bridge, as far as we know, to get to this general area. And those are haplogroups A, B, C, and D, with B being the far most prominent one.
A haplogroup is a genetic population group of people who share a common ancestor on the paternal or maternal lineage. Haplogroups are assigned letters of the alphabet, and refinements consist of additional number and letter combinations.
So we did that analysis, and we traced the mitochondrial genome of these two elongated skulls to the haplogroup that most closely compares to the mitochondrial DNA of the two elongated skulls is in the Black Sea region of Central Asia. This particular haplogroup is most strongly represented in this region around the Black Sea. And it's very interesting because in that region, you find elongated skulls.
You don't have genetic adaptation in 2,000 or 3,000 or even 10,000 years. You're talking probably hundreds of thousands of years. So you have this sudden rise of similar culture or similar looking people, quote unquote, in very distant, separate lands. That doesn't fit in with evolution as we know it. You know, a sudden appearance and then a rapid disappearance of these people.